Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the deep dive that cuts through the noise and gets straight to the theological core of the matter.
Today, we are undertaking a pretty substantial deep dive into the book of Deuteronomy. We've collected scholarly viewpoints that focus on its legal, historical, and its theological structure.
Specifically, how it defines the relationship between God and Israel.
Yes, that's the heart of it.
Our mission today is to distill the book's core theology, which is, I think, for many people, surprisingly complex. It's so much more than just a list of rules.
It really is. Deuteronomy is, in many ways, the pivot point of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
It's Moses' last will and testament, delivered right as Israel is on the cusp of entering the Promised Land.
Right, and the immediate call is pretty straightforward. Obey Yahweh, and you get to enter and stay in the land.
But that's where the central tension comes in. The intellectual pivot of the whole discussion is this striking stipulation that divine grace comes before the demand.
Okay, that's the key. Grace precedes demand. So if we look at the theology, the entire book is centered on Israel's absolute submission to Yahweh's lordship.
It's completely theocentric. It's all about the king.
And because it starts with what God has already done, his choosing and redeeming them, and yet it also predicts their failure, it builds this framework that, well, it anticipates the pattern of salvation we see in the New Covenant.
It does. We have to start with the gift before we can even begin to talk about the requirements for keeping it.
All right, let's unpack that sequence then. The priority of divine grace. The idea that the relationship, the status, the identity, all of that is secured before any rules are even issued.
That is the basic principle running through the whole book. Grace precedes demand. Obedience isn't presented as a way to, earn a relationship with God.
It's a response.
It's a grateful response for a relationship that has already been established through his choice and his mighty acts.
We have a couple of really good ways to illustrate this. You brought up the analogy of the drowning victim and the lifeguard, which I think makes the order crystal clear.
It does. I mean, think about it. A lifeguard sees someone drowning.
Okay.
The lifeguard doesn't stand on the edge of the pool shouting, technical instructions on the proper breaststroke as a condition for saving them.
Of course not. That would be absurd.
The lifeguard first jumps in, pulls the victim out, secures them safely on the shore. That rescue is the gift. That's the initial grace.
And only after they're safe, breathing, and on solid ground.
Only then does the lifeguard maybe explain the pool safety rules. Those are the demands for staying safe within that new life you've been given.
So the demands are the conditions for staying in the place of blessing. They're not the payment for entering it.
Exactly. And that same logic applies to Adam in the Garden of Eden, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Adam was placed in the garden by God's gracious action. His one job, to obey the single command, was the condition for maintaining that life.
Not a payment he had to make to get in.
Right. And the moment he disobeyed, he lost the ability to stay. Deuteronomy is basically setting up Israel as a new Adam in a new garden with a covenant to keep.
And this principle is tied directly to the physical land itself. The Promised Land isn't a prize they won. It's a literal, tangible gift.
It is entirely a gift. The territory is consistently described with the Hebrew verb natan.
Which means?
It just means to give or to grant. It is never presented as a wage or a reward that Israel earned through military might or, spiritual goodness.
It's a grant that fulfills the oath Yahweh swore to the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Which forces the people to understand they are inheriting based on God's fidelity, on his promise, not on their own virtue.
They're inheriting a land they didn't labor for, cities they didn't build, wells they didn't dig. It forces them to see God's action at every single turn.
Exactly. And the land itself is described in these incredibly lavish, detailed terms. It's meant to remind you of the Garden of Eden.
It's a place of rest, of immense bounty, designed to replace that harsh, transient life of the wilderness.
We're talking about an abundance that just completely dwarfs their experience with manna in the desert.
Oh, yeah. The description is so detailed. It's a land of brooks and fountains and springs, water flowing in valleys and hills.
Staple crops like wheat and barley, but also luxury crops.
Vines, fig trees, pomegranates, olive trees, yeah. And this isn't just about food. The land yields natural resources, things that support civilization. Iron from the stones, copper from the hills.
And they're told over and over again never to think, my own strength and the might of my own hand have gained me this wealth.
Because the wealth and the blessing are solely gifts from the Lord.
Okay, so if the land is a pure gift, then their election, their status as God's chosen people, that must also be based on grace, completely without merit.
And Deuteronomy spends a surprising amount of time just tearing down any idea of Israelite virtue.
It's almost aggressive about it.
It is. The book completely rejects the notion that Israel was chosen because they were uniquely good or numerous or even willing to accept the covenant. It's the polar opposite of saying God looked around and picked the best nation.
And the reason for this choice, it's hidden. It's concealed within the nature of the king himself.
That's the mystery. God set his love on them simply because he chose to love them. It comes from his mysterious, inexplicable affection. The reason is one of the secret things that belong to the Lord.
Which means it's beyond human understanding.
And it prevents Israel from ever boasting about their election.
In fact, Moses gives them overwhelming evidence against their own merit. He calls them a difficult people.
He does, repeatedly.
Yeah.
Stubborn and recalcitrant. He brings up their whole history of rebellion in the wilderness and kind of consolidates it into one point. He basically says, look, you've been rebellious since the day I first knew you.
And the climax of that evidence is the golden calf incident.
That's the one. And it's not treated as just an isolated failure. It's presented as the emblem of their rebellion.
The signature and emblem of their failure.
Yes. The covenant words were barely finished, hardly even written on the tablets, before Israel violated the very first rules against idolatry.
Which proves beyond any doubt that they were chosen despite their nature, not because of some inherent righteousness.
They were chosen while they were actively inclined not to follow him. This just illustrates divine grace at its most sovereign. He's choosing an object not because of what it is, but because of the unilateral desire of the chooser.
Which makes that sequencing redemption before regulation so important. Israel is called to obedience because God acted, not so that God will act.
That's the covenant structure in a nutshell. Allegiance flows from memory and gratitude. Israel is summoned to obey in grateful response to a salvation that's already happened.
He already delivered them from slavery in Egypt. They weren't called to obey to earn their freedom.
They were freed, and now they're called to live like a free people under their new king.
How does Moses portray that initial redemption? Is it just a dry historical fact?
No, it's framed with so much intimacy and strength. God acted as a divine warrior who crushed the military machine of Egypt. He set them free with a powerful hand and an outstretched arm.
But at the same time,
He protected them in the wilderness. He acted like a father, carrying Israel as a man carries his son through the desert.
that dual image of power and intimacy, that's the basis for their required allegiance.
It is. They must never forget what the Lord has done for them.
This focus on prior grace really sets the stage perfectly for the demand. The rules aren't arbitrary. They're the natural expression of loyalty to the one who saved you.
Right.
So let's shift our focus to that necessary response, the covenant demand, and how it establishes Yahweh's absolute kingship. What does this grateful response look like in practice?
It requires nothing less than total allegiance to Yahweh. The core issue that determines Israel's future is whether they genuinely recognize and submit to him as their absolute king and Lord.
And Moses stresses that these commands are comprehensive. They speak to every single area of life.
The market, the family, the courts, even future leadership. It's all covered.
And to really drive home this idea of Yahweh as the ultimate sovereign, the writers use a specific, almost technical vocabulary for the instruction itself.
We have to look at those terms. They tell us something about the nature of the demand.
Okay, so what are they?
The most common term is commandments, miwal. It occurs 46 times. Its frequency is a big deal because it directly signifies Yahweh's sovereignty and kingship.
So he's issuing binding instructions as the absolute ruler.
Precisely. Miwot frames the demands as royal decrees.
What about the terms that are more focused on societal order?
Those fill out the picture. We have the rules miham, which you see 37 times. These are about what is right and just within society, the legal and judicial side of things.
Okay.
Then you have statutes, tukim used 21 times. These are about what God has prescribed, often related to ritual or fixed boundaries Israel can't cross.
And the big one, the one that covers the whole system.
That's the law Torah. It occurs 22 times. And while we translate it as law, it's really better understood as instruction or teaching. It refers to the whole body of demands Yahweh issues as their covenant Lord.
The diversity of those four terms shows that his sovereignty is total. It governs everything.
From personal piety to court procedure.
But this sounds like an external legal structure, and yet the instruction immediately pivots back to the need for internal, genuine devotion.
That is the crucial move in Deuteronomy.
This allegiance isn't satisfied by just going through the motions.
No, it has to flow from the heart. True obedience must be an expression of real, deep affection. The central demand, the one all others come from, is that Israel must love Yahweh with all their heart, all their soul, and all their might.
And this love is the internal fuel that drives the concrete action. It results in the desire to keep his commands.
Yes, and that love is tied directly to fear. Now for us, that combination, loving God and fearing Him at the same time, can sound a bit strange.
It can sound contradictory in a modern context, for sure. How does Deuteronomy hold them together?
In the covenant framework, there are two sides of the same coin. Those who love the Lord will inevitably fear Him. And this fear isn't, slavish terror.
It's reverence.
It's reverence. It's recognizing His absolute supremacy, His power, the honor He deserves. It's the healthy awe that stops them from departing from His commands. It's knowing He is the true ruler who holds life and death in His hands.
And there's that one verb the writers use to describe this devotion that I think we need to spend a little more time on, the idea of clinging.
Dabak. It's one of the most powerful covenantal terms in the Old Testament. It means to hold fast, to cleave to cling to.
And we need to remember where this word first showed up. Genesis 2.24, describing a man's devotion to his wife.
So applying that same vocabulary of marital intimacy to Israel's relationship with Yahweh is completely intentional.
It signals that this allegiance has to be an affectionate, intimate devotion.
It is. It's a loyalty that mirrors Ruth clinging to Naomi, a voluntary, joyous, unbreakable bond. This reframes keeping the commandments. It's not a bureaucratic checklist.
It's an expression of love and closeness.
Yahweh is to be the true praise and joy of Israel's heart. Their obedience is driven by connection, not by coercion.
This submission to Yahweh's kingship clearly covers individual devotion, but what's so interesting is how quickly it translates into social requirements. It just permeates every part of society.
The demand for justice is everywhere. If Israel is truly submitting to a righteous king, their society has to reflect that righteousness.
To live and stay in the land, they have to pursue justice and only justice.
Which requires absolute impartiality from judges and officials. They have to be incorruptible. No class or wealth bias in how the king's law is carried out.
Can we get into some specific examples? How does this justice mandate actually work out in daily life?
The examples are very practical. They focus on protecting the vulnerable. So it mandates generosity toward the poor, widows, orphans, and sojourners, the social classes that had no tribal protection or economic power.
And Israel is commanded to remember their own status as sojourners in Egypt.
Yes, so their own experience of oppression should fuel their compassion for others.
What about the marketplace? Does God's kingship regulate business?
It demands total fairness, using correct and accurate weights and measures. Fraudulent scales are called an abomination.
Because they're a breach of justice and trust. It's basically stealing from your neighbor.
Right. Economic exploitation is just as offensive to Yahweh as ritual sin.
And what about labor?
You see these compassionate economic rules. Hired workers have to be paid their wages promptly at the end of the day because they might be depending on that small sum to survive.
And there are also rules about debt relief and gleaning laws.
Leaving the corners of the field unharvested so the poor can gather food. These social mandates all reflect the character of Yahweh. They're a non-negotiable part of their obedience. They are all expressions of Mio, the king's decree over all of life.
Maybe the clearest, most powerful application of Yahweh's supremacy over all human authority is in the rules for the king himself, the highest human official.
And he is emphatically not an absolute monarch.
He is constrained in every direction. The future king is explicitly told to fear the Lord his whole reign.
And this serves one purpose, to make sure that Yahweh, not the human king, remains supreme in Israel. The human king's authority is entirely subordinate.
How does that subordination actually manifest?
He has to personally write out a copy of the law from a book.
He has to write it himself.
Yes, and this act of writing it and then reading it every day makes him a constitutional ruler, in the truest sense. He has to constantly remember his subordinate status to the divine king.
To stop his heart from becoming proud or exalting himself above his people.
Right, and the sources detail 3 specific things the king is not allowed to accumulate. These prohibitions are key because they anticipate the 3 classic ways human power tries to become independent of God.
Absolutely. The king is warned against accumulating horses, gold, and wives. Let's break down why those three things are so dangerous.
Okay, let's start with the horses.
Horses.
Horses represent military strength and foreign alliances. By telling the king not to multiply horses, Yahweh is restricting him from relying on Egypt or other foreign powers for security.
He has to trust in Yahweh's arm, not his own cavalry.
Military strength must be seen as a gift from God, not a means of independent survival.
Okay, next is gold. That speaks to personal wealth, financial independence.
Correct. Gold represents excessive wealth and self-sufficiency. If the king piles up massive personal wealth, he risks thinking he's rich and doesn't need anyone, which leads to pride and oppressing his people.
His treasure is supposed to be the law itself.
Exactly. And finally, the multiplying of wives.
Which, in this context, is really about political alliances.
Primarily, yes. By marrying foreign princesses, the king naturally imports foreign gods and foreign customs, and that leads the whole nation into idolatry.
So these three things, military strength, wealth, and foreign alliances, are perfectly designed to limit the king's power.
To ensure his personal whims and preferences don't replace the divine law.
It sets an incredible standard. The person with the most human authority has to be the one most subject to the King of Kings.
Which sets the bar for everyone else.
This leads us perfectly into the need for exclusive devotion. Since Yahweh is the unique and absolute sovereign king, exclusive devotion is mandatory.
Idolatry in this system isn't just a spiritual mistake. It is high treason against the ruling monarch.
And this demand for exclusivity requires cleansing. This is where we have to address the intense instructions about worship and cleansing the new Eden.
Right. Because Israel is entering a land filled with spiritual rivals, the gods of the Canaanites. They have to be guarded from all forms of mixing their worship.
Idolatry just substitutes something else for the worship of the one true God.
And that can't be tolerated by an absolute sovereign. Israel must not make any image to represent the Lord, nor worship anything else in creation.
And to stop them from worshiping based on their own creativity or local customs, Deuteronomy insists on a single centralized place for worship.
That's one of the most prominent features of the book. Israel must worship Yahweh only in the single place he chooses, which is deliberately left unnamed at this point in the text.
And this geographical rule serves as a barrier against unauthorized worship.
It does. If every town set up its own shrine, it would inevitably lead to syncretism, blending Yahweh worship with the local Canaanite rituals. Centralized, regulated worship ensures purity.
What I find so interesting is that this adherence to ritual purity isn't presented as some somber duty. It's meant to be a joyful occasion.
Absolutely. When Israel worships, brings their tithes, observes the festivals, they are commanded to rejoice. They're told to eat before the Lord and be altogether joyful.
Sharing fellowship with God and enjoying the good things he's provided.
Obedience is meant to be a glad-hearted response to a generous king.
Okay, this brings us to what is probably the most difficult instruction in the entire book. The absolute need for purity that leads to the command of utter destruction, the harem or the barnanu.
We have to address the theological logic behind this.
We do. It's severe.
The harem is a concept of utter dedication or devotion, and in this context, it means dedication for destruction. It targets specific things that pose a threat of spiritual infection so severe it would destroy Israel's covenant with Yahweh.
The destruction is mandated to preserve their exclusive devotion and the holiness of the land.
And we see it applied in three specific areas. First, the peoples of Canaan.
Yeah.
Why must they be annihilated?
The total destruction was required specifically for those nations within the narrow geographical boundaries of the Promised Land.
And the reason given is very explicit. These nations would inevitably turn Israel away from the Lord into idolatry, divination, and horrific practices like child sacrifice. The text frames Canaan as a new Eden, which has to be rigorously cleansed from evil to keep its holiness.
It's a spiritual quarantine. If the contamination stays, the nation dies.
It's like necessary surgical removal to save the patient. The Canaanite practices, consulting mediums, witchcraft, passing children through the fire, were an existential threat to Israel's relationship with Yahweh.
So their destruction is a protective measure.
To safeguard Israel's spiritual health and covenant status. Second, the cultic objects of these nations.
Right. The religious artifacts, altars, sacred pillars, Asherah poles, graven images.
All of it has to be completely destroyed, burned with fire, and their names wiped out. These objects are a powerful, visible temptation. Their annihilation ensures no rivals to Yahweh remain.
And third, the demand for purity extends internally. If the infection comes from within Israel itself, an apostate city, the same judgment has to apply.
If an Israelite city promotes idolatry, encouraging the community to follow other gods, it has to face internal harm.
Which shows that Yahweh's judgment is impartial. It falls on disobedience no matter who you are.
To stop the spread of that infection, Israel must show no pity, even to family members who advocate for other gods. The entire city is to be put to death, and the city itself burned, becoming a perpetual mound of ruins.
It's a terrifying severity, but it underscores the absolute seriousness of covenant fidelity.
And yet this severity, required for holiness, is contrasted so strikingly with specific restraints placed on Israel during warfare.
It shows a distinction between spiritual cleansing and just wanton destruction.
That contrast is theologically vital. The command for harem is not a general license for brutality or environmental recklessness. The sources highlight clear ecological compassion. During a siege, Israel must not destroy the fruit trees around the city.
And the text gives that great rhetorical question to justify it.
Yes, are the trees in the field human, that they should be besieged by you? Fruit trees are necessary for life. They're part of the created order Yahweh sustains, and they must be preserved.
And similarly, they're told not to take a mother bird with her young.
These restraints show a concern for the continuity of creation and the food supply, even while the agents of spiritual infection are ruthlessly purged.
So the violence is highly focused and theological. It's aimed at spiritual contamination, not general destruction. We should also clarify the geographical limits here.
That is a key distinction. For cities and countries distant from the land, Israel was required to offer terms of peace first. If those distant enemies refused, only the adult males were to be killed.
Women and children were spared.
Yes, the total sweeping destruction of harem was restricted only to the nations inside Canaan who held those specific religious practices that pose the spiritual threat.
And we should also note the nations Yahweh specifically told Israel to spare.
They were explicitly commanded not to contend with or take the lands belonging to Edom, Moab, or Ammon. Yahweh says, I will not give you any of their land.
Which demonstrates that the command to possess the land was highly selective and focused.
It was aimed at the geographical inheritance promised to the patriarchs, not a general mandate for global conquest. The entire logic is theological quarantine, not territorial expansionism.
This intense setup, the gracious gift, the rigorous demand for loyalty, it brings us to the central paradox of the book.
The reality of failure and the need for a new heart.
This is where Deuteronomy really pivots from instruction to prophecy. Moses has laid out the perfect constitution for life in this new Eden, but the conditions are strict.
The tenure of the land is entirely conditional. Israel faces a stark choice. Obedience leads to life and possession. Disobedience leads to death and expulsion exile.
And while the entry is a gift of grace, staying there is strictly contingent on fulfilling the covenant conditions.
And this is where Moses steps out of his role as lawgiver and becomes a prophet. He doesn't just present the choice. He predicts the inevitable outcome.
And it is overwhelmingly negative.
That prophetic tension is signaled by the structure of the curses and blessings themselves. It's totally disproportionate.
It really is. The blessings, promising prosperity and safety, they take up, 14 verses in Deuteronomy 28.
And in sharp contrast, the curses threatening disease, defeat, and exile span over 50 verses.
That waiting alone signals that the curses are the tragic reality Moses anticipates for Israel.
He forecasts that despite the perfect law and the clearest warning, Israel is bound to fail. They will inevitably transgress the covenant. Why?
If they have the instruction right there, why the guaranteed failure?
The reason for failure is internal capacity. Moses reveals that the Lord has not yet given them the essential tool for obedience.
They lack the spiritual ability. Moses says it clearly. Israel lacks a heart to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear.
He tells them, circumcise your own hearts. But he immediately knows they can't do it. They lack the spiritual motor to follow through because of their inherent stubborn, rebellious nature.
The one we saw evidenced by the golden calf?
It's a vicious circle of spiritual deficiency. The law itself, though holy and good, cannot impart the life needed to fulfill it. And this structural problem, the righteous demand meeting the sinful heart, it perfectly mirrors the failure of Adam.
So Israel's historical trajectory mirrors Adam's fall.
It completes the parallel. Like Adam, Israel is placed in a new Eden by sheer grace, given a perfect command and warned of expulsion if they fail.
But like Adam, Israel's failure to maintain covenant purity guarantees their expulsion exile from the place of blessing.
The covenant demands function to expose the depth of the patient's fatal condition.
Let's use that medical analogy. Moses delivers the law, but the law itself acts like a diagnosis, proving the patient can't follow the prescribed regimen.
Think of the law, delivered by Moses, as a perfectly accurate diagnostic tool. It identifies the patient's Israel's fatal heart condition, their inherent stubbornness and rebellion.
Moses prescribes a regimen, the Torah, which is the perfect standard of life.
But he simultaneously prophesies that the patient will inevitably collapse because they lack the capacity to follow that regimen.
And that collapse, the exile becomes necessary for a greater purpose.
Exactly. The collapse is needed not just to punish, but to demolish their arrogance and belief in human strength. The exile serves to humble Israel, proving their total inability to save or sustain themselves,
The law functions to drive Israel to desperation.
forcing them to look outside of their own efforts. And this sets the stage for the final, ultimate act of grace, a divine solution that transcends human ability.
The resolution has to come from God, because the problem is congenital.
Moses looks beyond the inevitable judgment and exile to a time when Yahweh himself will intervene to cure Israel's fundamental defect. After the exile, God promises to perform an eschatological work.
He will circumcise Israel's heart. That's Deuteronomy 30, verse 6.
This divine intervention finally enables the possibility of the total allegiance that Moses commanded but knew they couldn't achieve.
Yes, God's promise is that he will perform this sovereign act of spiritual surgery so that they will finally love the Lord fully with all their heart and soul.
And this act of ultimate grace will enable them to obey him completely. This is the new covenant foreshadowed right here. It's the promise of regeneration that prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel later develop.
So Deuteronomy, which on the surface seems like a book about rules, is actually structured to prove that the rules cannot be kept.
And that the people need divine heart surgery to survive. It's the ultimate setup. It demands perfection, knowing that demand will expose depravity, which leads to the prophecy of the divine solution.
Okay, let's move to our final section, the superior prophet and final fulfillment. The book ends not just with the promise of a new heart, but with the failure of the old mediator, Moses.
Which sets the stage for the necessary, perfect mediator.
The conclusion is so moving and significant. Moses, the lawgiver, the friend of God, was himself prohibited from leading the people into the land. He's portrayed as a sinner whose disobedience keeps him out.
And his exclusion serves a vital theological purpose for the listener. It's a powerful demonstration of the consequences of disobedience, even for the greatest of men.
It reinforces the severity of the covenant demands and confirms that even the mediator of the old covenant failed to meet the standard,
Foreshadowing the need for a perfect mediator.
And the final historical note of the Old Testament era confirms that the role Moses played was unique and was left empty for centuries.
Yes, the book concludes with a recognition that no prophet like Moses has arisen in Israel in the entire Old Testament era. Moses was unique. He spoke with Yahweh face to face.
And while Joshua succeeded Moses as the political and military leader,
Neither he nor the later judges or prophets filled that specific, authoritative prophetic role. This prophetic gap is a deliberate literary device that points clearly to a future need for a superior figure.
and the sources confirm the identity of the fulfillment of that prophecy in the New Covenant, Jesus of Nazareth.
Jesus Christ is identified as the superior prophet predicted by Moses in Deuteronomy 18. Yahweh promised, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you, and I will put my words in his mouth."
Only with the coming of Jesus did such a prophet arise.
One who announces God's ultimate word, brings in the kingdom, and possesses an authority that Moses lacked.
And crucially, Jesus doesn't just preach the word with Moses' authority. He possesses the ability to fulfill the eschatological promise that Moses anticipated.
Precisely. Moses could only diagnose the problem, the uncircumcised heart, and give the law that exposed human weakness. Jesus, however, is the prophet capable of performing the ultimate divine work of circumcising the people's hearts.
Which enables his followers to love and obey the Lord fully, achieving what the law demanded but could not accomplish.
And the Apostle Paul draws this connection explicitly in the New Testament. He reinterprets a passage that originally sounds like a call to perfect legal obedience.
Into a statement of faith.
In Romans 10, Paul takes Deuteronomy 30, where Moses says, "The word is near you," and interprets it radically. Moses had initially presented the commandment as not being too difficult or far away to obey.
Implying it was attainable.
But given Israel's predicted and actual failure, Paul views this passage not as a call to legal obedience, but as a reference to the word of faith concerning Jesus Christ.
That is a huge theological move. Why is he justified in doing that?
Because the entire theological structure of Deuteronomy leads to this conclusion. The law proves humanity's inability. Therefore, the word that is near is not the unattainable standard of the law.
But the accessible path of faith in the Messiah who fulfilled the law.
Paul confirms that salvation is secured not by our own disobedient effort, but by looking outside of ourselves to the risen Lord. The new Exodus redemption in Christ is God's completed work on behalf of his people.
This has been a truly comprehensive deep dive into how Deuteronomy functions not just as ancient law, but as a pointer to the gospel. Let's just trace the central message one last time.
Okay, we can trace it through 5 clear steps.
Yeah.
Grace, election, provides the gift, the land.
This gifted status is maintained by demand, obedience,
However, human inability guarantees failure, exile.
necessitating God's future work, a new heart.
Delivered through the superior prophet, Christ. The book is perfectly calibrated to teach Israel, and us, that we need total redemption from a king who is both sovereign over the demands and sovereign over the solution.
That's absolutely critical.
Yeah.
The call for total allegiance, the Maro, ultimately demonstrates that we need a king who not only issues the commands, but also performs the necessary heart transformation required to keep them.
The supremacy of Yahweh's kingship is the core idea. Everything flows from that.
And that brings us back to the king's mandate in Deuteronomy, where the highest temporal authority was strictly limited by the fear of Yahweh, bound by the law in a book, and restricted from relying on human strength like horses, gold, and alliances. So here's a final provocative thought for you to consider. If the supreme temporal authority of Israel the king was strictly limited and regulated by the fear of Yahweh, how should the absolute supremacy of Christ as our king regulate the way we approach all our temporal authority and obligations today? We'll see you next time on Reformed Thinking.